The showroom was silent, save for the quiet hum of the lights above. Alexis Carter stood at the entrance, her heart racing, her palms sweating. The polished marble floor stretched before her like a cold, unforgiving ocean. She was 17, dressed in a plain school uniform, her sneakers worn from months of use. And yet, her gaze was unwavering as she stepped inside the glistening luxury car dealership, where the air smelled faintly of leather and polished chrome. The employees barely spared her a second glance. They went back to their conversations, their laughter low, knowing she was just another teenager with nothing to offer. Blake Thompson, the dealership's manager, noticed her immediately. His eyes narrowed. He didn't need to ask who she was or why she was there. She didn't belong. "Excuse me," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "This place is for people who can afford a car, not for window shopping." He pointed dismissively toward the exit, his lips curling into a mocking smile. A few employees chuckled softly. Nearby customers exchanged glances, some intrigued, others amused. But Alexis didn't flinch. She stood tall, her back straight, and without a word she walked out, the door sliding shut behind her with a soft whoosh. The next day, a sleek Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up to the dealership. The sun shone on the gleaming body, casting reflections across the polished glass. When the door opened, Blake's confident smile faltered. A tall man, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, stepped out. His presence was commanding. And then the man spoke. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, his voice rich with authority. "My name is Marcus Carter. I'm here because my daughter was here yesterday, and I believe she didn't receive the treatment she deserved." Blake's stomach turned. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the words failing him as Marcus's gaze met his. The young girl he had mocked, the one he thought would never belong here, was his daughter. And now he had to answer to her father. Alexis stepped into the dealership, her school uniform slightly wrinkled, her sneakers worn down from months of use. The showroom, with its high ceilings and polished marble floors, felt like a world far removed from the one she knew. The gleaming cars, from Ferraris to Bentleys, seemed to mock her. She wasn't supposed to be here, not in a place like this. Blake Thompson, the sales manager, saw her immediately. His gaze swept over her with an air of dismissal. A young girl in a school uniform, obviously out of place. "Excuse me," Blake sneered, his voice laced with contempt. "This is a place for real customers. You've wandered into the wrong showroom." He gestured toward the exit, as if his words were an invitation for her to leave. The employees, hidden in the corners of the showroom, exchanged amused glances. Nearby customers looked on curiously, sensing the tension. Alexis's cheeks flushed with heat. She could feel the judgment in the air, could almost taste the mockery that hung around her. But she refused to let it show. She straightened her back, took a deep breath, and without a word, she turned and walked out of the showroom, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence behind her. She didn't look back. The door slid shut with a soft whoosh, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the lights and the faint laughter that followed her out. Outside, the cold air hit her face, but she didn't flinch. The sting of humiliation burned, but she refused to let it break her. This wasn't the end. The next morning, a sleek Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up to the dealership. Its dark black exterior gleamed in the sunlight, casting sharp reflections across the showroom. The hum of the engine slowed to a gentle purr as the car came to a stop in front of the glass doors. Blake Thompson, still reeling from the previous day's encounter, looked up from his desk. He felt the rush of excitement that always came with high-profile customers. But today was different. The car wasn't the only thing that demanded attention. The door opened and a tall figure stepped out. The man was impeccably dressed in a gray suit, his posture straight, his presence commanding the space around him. He was older, but there was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. Blake's smile faltered as the man turned to face him. His eyes were sharp, assessing. It didn't take long for Blake to realize this wasn't just any customer. "Good morning, gentlemen," the man said in a deep, controlled voice. "I'm Marcus Carter. I'm here because my daughter was here yesterday, and I believe she didn't receive the treatment she deserved." Blake froze, the blood drained from his face. His mind raced to connect the dots, but the pieces didn't fall into place immediately. Alexis Carter, Marcus continued, his gaze never leaving Blake's. She was the young girl you dismissed yesterday, the one you mocked. Blake swallowed hard. His throat went dry, the words stuck. He looked back at his colleagues, but no one seemed willing to help. The weight of Marcus's stare was heavy, and Blake's arrogance, once so certain, now felt like a distant memory. The showroom was quiet, the tension palpable. The man in front of him was no ordinary customer, and now, Blake knew, he would have to face the consequences of his actions. Blake's mouth went dry as he stared at Marcus, his mind racing to recover from the shock. He had mocked Alexis, underestimated her, and now, standing in front of him was the very person who had every right to make him pay for it. "Mr. Carter," Blake stammered, trying to steady his voice. I didn't realize, Marcus cut him off with a smooth, controlled motion, his voice firm but not raised. "You didn't realize?" He glanced at the showroom around them, the wealth on display like an unspoken promise. "Or perhaps you just assumed someone like my daughter wouldn't belong here." Blake swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. The weight of his mistake hung in the air like a thick fog. He wanted to apologize, but the words seemed hollow, and he didn't know where to begin. "She came in here yesterday," Marcus continued, his eyes cold. "Not for attention, not for a photo opportunity, but because she wanted to buy me a gift, a meaningful one. A Lamborghini Aventador SVJ Roadster." Blake's stomach turned as the reality of his actions hit him harder. He had dismissed the young girl, assuming she had no business in such a place. Now the joke was on him. "I see," Blake muttered, his voice shaky. "Deeply sorry, Mr. Carter, if I had known." "You should have known," Marcus interrupted, his voice quiet but cutting through the silence like a blade. "It's not about knowing, Blake. It's about respecting everyone, no matter their appearance. You don't get to decide who belongs here based on the way they look." The showroom was still, all eyes on them. Blake could feel the weight of judgment from his colleagues and the customers watching from afar. This wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about something much bigger. "Your actions, Mr. Thompson, were not just rude," Marcus said, his tone unwavering. "They were damaging. And now you'll understand the consequences." Blake nodded, unable to meet Marcus's gaze any longer. He wanted to protest, to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come. He had no defense for what he had done. The silence stretched on, the tension growing thick around them. Marcus stood in the middle of the showroom, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around. Blake could feel the weight of his stare, the unspoken challenge in the air. Marcus's eyes didn't waver from Blake's face, and for a moment, Blake felt like a child being scolded by a father. "I didn't come here to make a scene," Marcus said calmly, his voice deep and steady. "I came here to set things right for my daughter." Blake felt his knees grow weak. The room seemed to close in on him, the weight of his actions pressing down. He could feel the eyes of the employees on him, some of them with quiet judgment, others unsure of what was happening. "I've been in this industry long enough to know that people like you, people who think wealth gives them the right to look down on others, are everywhere," Marcus continued. "But I'm not here to let you get away with it." Blake's hands trembled slightly, but he clenched them into fists to steady himself. He tried to find the words, but they eluded him. What could he possibly say to make up for what he had done? Marcus stepped closer, his eyes still locked onto Blake's. "You humiliated my daughter in front of everyone, assuming she didn't belong here because of how she looked. But you were wrong. And now you'll understand what happens when someone like you gets it wrong." Blake's mouth went dry, his earlier arrogance vanishing into the air like smoke. He wanted to defend himself, but he knew there was no excuse. No amount of words could undo what had been said. "Mr. Thompson, I'm not here to buy a car," Marcus said, his tone now colder, more decisive. "I'm here because you need to learn that respect isn't something you can buy. It's earned." Blake felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had never felt smaller, never felt more exposed. The anger that had once filled him now felt like an empty void, replaced by a sense of dread. "I will be making sure you understand this lesson, Blake," Marcus added, his voice sharp. "And I'll make sure you never forget it." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Blake couldn't speak. All he could do was stand there, consumed by the realization of just how far he had gone. Blake stood motionless, his face drained of color. His arrogance, which had once been his armor, now felt like an empty shell. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Marcus Carter, standing before him, had shattered everything Blake had ever known about power, respect, and dignity. Marcus didn't look at Blake with anger. It was something much colder: disappointment. "I want you to understand what you've done," Marcus continued, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "What you did wasn't just wrong, it was harmful. You made my daughter feel like she didn't belong here, like she wasn't worthy of the very things this dealership claims to represent. You treated her like she was invisible." Blake opened his mouth, but no words came out. The reality of what he had done was sinking in like a heavy stone. He had judged Alexis. He had humiliated her. And now, standing in front of her father, he realized the full extent of his mistake. Marcus glanced at the other employees, all of whom had been watching in silence. Their faces were a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. No one said a word, but the atmosphere in the showroom had completely shifted. Blake was no longer the one in control. "You will apologize to my daughter," Marcus said, his voice cold and decisive. "Not just with words, but with action. You will show her the respect she deserves." Blake's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to justify himself, but deep down, he knew there was no excuse for what he had done. His own prejudice had blinded him, and now the consequences were inescapable. "I will," Blake finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes." Marcus didn't nod or smile. There was no sign of forgiveness in his eyes, only a silent understanding that Blake's apology would mean nothing if it wasn't backed by change. "I want you to spend time at my charity," Marcus said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "You'll work with children who have been treated like Alexis. Maybe then you'll begin to understand what real respect is, what real worth looks like." Blake stood there, frozen, his mind racing with the weight of what was being asked of him. But as the silence stretched on, the room filled with the undeniable reality that this moment was not just about a mistake, it was about a turning point. "Consider this your first lesson, Blake," Marcus said, his voice quiet but filled with authority. "You'll learn to respect those you've dismissed. You'll learn to see them for who they truly are." Blake didn't respond. He couldn't. All he could do was nod, feeling the weight of his own shame pressing down on him, the gravity of his actions settling over him like a heavy burden. The next day, Blake stood at the entrance of the Carter Foundation Charity Center. The building was modest compared to the shiny luxury of the dealership, but there was a warmth to it, a sense of purpose that Blake couldn't quite place. He wasn't used to being in a place like this. His hands were clenched at his sides, his eyes scanning the surroundings, feeling out of place among the children and volunteers. Richard Mason, the dealership owner, stood beside him, looking equally uncomfortable. Blake had never felt more out of his element. This wasn't the polished showroom or the luxury cars he was accustomed to. This was something different, something raw. "Are we really doing this?" Blake muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with frustration. Richard shot him a glance but didn't respond. He was too aware of the gravity of the situation to engage in small talk. Blake was here because Marcus had insisted, and now there was no turning back. A woman in her mid-40s, with kind eyes and a warm smile, approached them. She introduced herself as Linda Harris, the center's manager. Her presence was calm, almost soothing, but Blake could tell she saw through his forced politeness. "Welcome," she said gently. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Mason, I'm glad you could join us. We're here to make sure everyone feels valued, no matter where they come from." Blake shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He didn't want to be here, didn't want to be part of this charity work, but there was a small voice in the back of his mind telling him that this was something he needed to do, something he deserved to do. "Let me show you around," Linda said, leading them into the center. Blake's eyes flicked around the room, taking in the children working on homework, the teachers assisting them, the volunteers helping with arts and crafts. He saw kids laughing, some talking, others quietly working. But the thing that struck him most was the palpable sense of community, something that was foreign to him in his world of high-end cars and luxury. As Linda guided them through the center, she pointed out various activities, each designed to help the children find joy, even in the face of adversity. Blake couldn't help but feel out of place. These children, many of them African American, were not the type of people he typically interacted with. They weren't the clients he catered to, and they certainly weren't the ones he had ever bothered to understand. "You can start by helping with the homework," Linda said, her voice still calm, but her eyes now sharp with expectation. "Or you can help prepare meals for the kids. They're going to need some assistance soon." Blake's stomach tightened. He didn't want to do either. The idea of sitting down with children who had so little and who were so different from the people he was used to helping made him uncomfortable. But he couldn't refuse. Not now. "I'm not really a babysitter," Blake muttered, his voice edged with annoyance. "I didn't come here for this kind of work." Linda didn't flinch. "You're not here to be a babysitter, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're here to learn. You're here to understand that dignity is not something tied to wealth. It's something we all deserve, no matter where we come from." Blake's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned and walked toward a group of kids sitting at a table, working on their assignments. He sat down awkwardly beside them, unsure of how to begin. His discomfort was palpable, but the children barely noticed, too engrossed in their work to care. One of the younger boys, no older than 8, looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "What's your name, mister?" the boy asked. Blake blinked, caught off guard by the question. He wasn't used to kids speaking to him like this. "Blake," he replied, his voice softer now. The boy smiled. "I'm Thomas, you here to help us?" Blake hesitated, unsure how to respond. He had never been forced to interact with kids like this before. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice gruff. "I'm here to help." Thomas didn't seem to mind the coldness in his voice. He just smiled and nodded, then went back to his homework. But Blake couldn't stop watching him. There was something in that smile, something that tugged at him. As the hours passed, Blake continued to help the kids with their assignments, though he did so reluctantly. His mind kept wandering, back to the showroom, back to his life of privilege. But every time his thoughts turned inward, he saw Thomas's smile, and it made him pause. By the end of the day, Blake's hands were sore from holding pencils, his back aching from sitting for so long. But as he prepared to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He didn't understand it, but there was something about being here, something about these children that made him feel different. Before he could leave, Thomas ran up to him. "You're leaving already?" he asked, his eyes full of innocence. Blake nodded. "Yes, kid, I'll see you around." But as he turned to walk away, he felt a hand on his sleeve. He looked down to see Thomas holding up an old, tattered backpack. "You think it's okay if I keep fixing it?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet but filled with hope. Blake looked at the backpack. It was worn, the straps fraying at the edges. And for the first time in his life, he felt a deep, unsettling tug in his chest. "Yeah," Blake said, his voice softer than before. "It's okay." Thomas smiled, and Blake walked out of the center, the weight of the day's experience heavy on his shoulders. It wasn't a complete change, not yet, but it was a start. And for Blake Thompson, that was the hardest part. Blake returned to the charity center the next day, his steps heavier than they had been before. The initial resistance had worn off, but there was still a sense of discomfort that clung to him. He walked through the door, glancing around the room as the same children from yesterday were busy at work, some reading, some talking, others helping each other with homework. Linda greeted him with a nod, a knowing look in her eyes. "Good to see you back," she said, her voice calm but full of expectation. Blake nodded but didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say. The truth was, he wasn't sure what he was doing here at all. It wasn't that he didn't want to help. He just didn't know how to help. The discomfort in his chest had evolved from annoyance to something deeper, something more difficult to define. He walked toward the group of kids he had worked with yesterday, the ones who had looked at him with curiosity, some with skepticism, but none with judgment. They had accepted him without question, and that made him feel something he couldn't name. It made him feel small. Thomas, the little boy from yesterday, looked up as Blake approached. "Hi, Blake," he said, grinning. "You're back." Blake forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm back," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. The boy's energy was infectious, and despite himself, Blake felt something warm spread inside him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time, genuine connection. "Can I help with something today?" Blake asked, his voice unsure but more open than the day before. The words felt foreign to him. Asking to help instead of being the one in charge was a shift that felt unnatural but necessary. Thomas looked at him, his eyes bright with trust. "Sure, you can help me with my math homework. I'm stuck on this part." Blake sat down beside Thomas, glancing at the worksheet. The numbers seemed simple, but Blake was careful not to assume. "Let's see what we've got," he said, trying to sound confident, though his mind was racing. This wasn't just about math. This was about something deeper, about understanding, about breaking down the walls that had kept him distant from people like Thomas. As they worked through the problems, Blake found himself focusing less on the task and more on the boy's demeanor. Thomas was eager, attentive, and patient. His smile never faltered, even when the answers didn't come quickly, and there was something beautiful in that. It was a kind of resilience Blake wasn't used to seeing, especially not in children who had every reason to give up. "Thanks, Blake," Thomas said as they finished the worksheet. "Getting better at this now." Blake nodded, the warmth he felt earlier settling in his chest. He didn't know what had shifted in him, but there was a quiet realization that this work, this small act of kindness, was teaching him something he had never known he needed to learn. "Anytime, kid," Blake replied, his voice steady, but softer now. He didn't know if it was the math, the time spent with Thomas, or simply the act of helping that made him feel this way, but there was no denying the shift inside him. Later in the day, as the center began to empty out, Blake sat on one of the benches by the window, staring out at the street. His mind wandered, reflecting on what he had seen and felt over the past 2 days. It was humbling. The arrogance he once held so tightly now felt like a weight he was desperate to shake off. Linda approached him, her eyes gentle but insightful. "You seem quieter today," she remarked, sitting down beside him. Blake looked at her, the question hanging in the air. "Just thinking," he said, his voice thick with emotion he didn't quite understand. Linda smiled softly. "Change isn't easy, Blake, but it's necessary. You're seeing the world differently now. That's the first step." Blake nodded slowly, his eyes still focused on the street outside. He knew she was right. This wasn't just about helping at a charity center or doing a task to get through the day. This was about opening his eyes to something he had closed off for too long. He glanced at Linda. "I don't know if I can change overnight," he admitted, "but I think I'm starting to see what you mean." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "That's all any of us can do. Take it one step at a time." Blake's heart felt lighter, the weight of his past mistakes not gone but more manageable, as if he were learning to carry them without letting them crush him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path, even if he didn't know where it led. As he left the center that day, he didn't feel the familiar bitterness he used to carry with him. Instead, there was a small seed of hope, a quiet belief that change was possible. It wasn't about a dramatic transformation overnight. It was about taking small steps, like the ones he had taken with Thomas, and building on them. Blake knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to walk the path ahead. Blake arrived at the charity center the next day, his steps slower but more deliberate than before. The discomfort that had once kept him at a distance was beginning to fade, replaced by something new, something unsettlingly familiar. It was humility, a feeling he hadn't truly experienced in years. As he walked through the door, Linda greeted him with a small nod, and this time Blake didn't look away. He was starting to feel like he belonged here, in this place that had once seemed so foreign to him. "Good to see you back," Linda said, her tone warm, yet there was a knowing edge to her words. "How are you feeling today?" Blake paused for a moment, thinking. "Different," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "But it's not easy. It's like I'm finally seeing things, but it's overwhelming." Linda smiled, a small, understanding curve of her lips. "That's a start, Blake. Change is never easy, but it's necessary. You're beginning to look beyond what's comfortable, and that's the hardest part." Blake nodded, his gaze turning toward the children who were now sitting in a circle, working on a new project. He recognized Thomas right away. The boy was sitting at a small desk, diligently working on an art project. Blake felt drawn to him, as if their brief connection from the day before had created an invisible thread between them. Blake walked over, sitting down at the table across from Thomas. The boy glanced up, his smile as bright as ever. "Hey, Blake," Thomas greeted, his eyes lighting up. "Are you going to help again?" Blake smiled back, though it was a bit unsure, still new to this side of himself. "Yeah," he said, his voice steadying with each word. "Here to help." "What are we working on today?" Thomas excitedly showed Blake the pieces of paper, markers, and crayons scattered across the table. "We're making posters for the big charity event next week. Want to help me draw a car?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine enthusiasm. Blake's heart clenched at the innocence in the boy's voice. Here was a child who had so little in terms of material wealth, but so much in terms of spirit. It was a humbling thing to witness. "A car, huh?" Blake chuckled softly, picking up a crayon. "Sure, I can do that." As Blake helped Thomas draw, he felt something inside of him shift. The walls he had so carefully built over the years were beginning to crack. Each stroke of the crayon, each smile from Thomas, chipped away at the arrogance Blake had carried for so long. He wasn't just drawing a car. He was drawing a connection, something he had never allowed himself to have with people from backgrounds like Thomas's. As the day wore on, Blake found himself immersed in the work. The discomfort of yesterday had been replaced with something more natural, something more human. Blake wasn't just helping anymore. He was learning, growing, changing. At the end of the day, as the children began to gather their things and prepare to leave, Thomas ran up to Blake, holding up his completed poster. "Look, Blake, I finished it." Blake looked down at the poster. It wasn't perfect by any standard, but it didn't need to be. It was full of color and life, a reflection of the child's creativity. And in that moment, Blake realized that Thomas's world wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience. It was about finding joy even in the simplest of things. "That looks amazing, Thomas," Blake said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Thomas beamed. "Thanks. I think it'll help a lot of people. If they see how awesome the event will be, they'll come and donate." Blake nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Sure it will," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. He didn't know what had changed in him, but he knew that the man he had been yesterday was slipping away. And the man who was emerging felt more human, more compassionate than he ever thought possible. As Blake walked out of the center later that afternoon, he paused at the door. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. For the first time in a long time, Blake didn't feel out of place. He felt a quiet sense of purpose, a realization that maybe, just maybe, he was capable of more than he had ever given himself credit for. The journey wasn't over, but Blake was no longer afraid of where it might lead. Blake stood at the door of the showroom, watching as the luxurious cars gleamed under the soft lights. It had been a few days since he'd last set foot here, and the place felt different now. The polished marble floor, the glistening vehicles, the air of exclusivity, none of it held the same power over him anymore. It all seemed empty, hollow in comparison to what he had been learning at the charity center. He had spent the last few days helping, learning, and listening. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. It was as though the walls that had kept him isolated from the real world were slowly crumbling, piece by piece. Today, Marcus was scheduled to meet with the dealership's management. Blake had been instructed to sit in on the meeting. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he was determined to face it head-on. As the door to the meeting room opened, Marcus walked in, his presence commanding the room instantly. Blake stood as Marcus approached, his mind racing. He had seen this man before, of course. He had mocked his daughter, assumed she wasn't worthy of the luxury this dealership was built on. But now, seeing him in person, Blake understood the true weight of his words and actions. This wasn't just a billionaire. This was a father, a man who valued dignity over wealth, who stood for something far greater than any luxury car on the showroom floor. Marcus took a seat at the head of the table, his gaze briefly meeting Blake's before addressing the room. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice calm but full of authority. "I'm here today not as a customer, but as someone who believes in respect, in integrity. The actions taken at this dealership, the prejudice shown toward my daughter are unacceptable, and it's time for change." Blake's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. The moment when everything that had happened in the past few days, the humbling experiences, the lessons, the reflections, would come full circle. "Blake," Marcus continued, turning his attention to him, "you've seen the work we're doing at the Carter Foundation. You've seen how dignity and respect are given, not earned by wealth or status, but by humanity. I expect the same level of respect to be reflected here at this dealership. No more prejudice. No more discrimination based on appearance or background." Blake felt the weight of Marcus's words press down on him. It was one thing to hear the words. It was another to feel them, to truly understand the impact of his actions. "I've made mistakes," Blake said, his voice quieter than usual but firm. "And I'm sorry, I'm learning, and I'm willing to do what it takes to change." The room was silent, and Blake could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. It was the first time in a long time he felt truly exposed, vulnerable, but also strangely liberated. He wasn't the arrogant manager anymore. He wasn't the man who thought his worth was defined by his wealth, his position, or his arrogance. Marcus nodded, his eyes softening just slightly. "That's a start, Blake. But words mean nothing if actions don't follow. This dealership will be making changes, starting with how we treat every customer, no matter their appearance or background. It's time for a new standard here, a standard built on respect, dignity, and equality." Blake's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just about him. This was about everyone in the showroom, everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of their appearance. And Blake was now a part of the solution. As the meeting ended, Blake remained seated for a moment, letting the weight of what had been said settle. He wasn't sure how things would change moving forward, but one thing was certain. He wasn't the same person who had mocked Alexis just days ago. He was someone different now, someone who had learned what it truly meant to respect others, to see them for who they were, not how much they had. As he walked out of the room, he passed by the showroom floor once more. The cars no longer seemed to sparkle with the same allure. Instead, Blake's gaze lingered on the people walking by, the families and individuals looking at the vehicles, each one deserving of respect. He wasn't the one in control anymore. It was the people who mattered, the ones who were often overlooked. And that was the lesson that would guide him from now on. Blake walked into the dealership on the morning of Marcus's birthday with a sense of quiet determination. It had been a few weeks since he'd stood in that showroom and made a decision to change, to truly listen and understand. Today wasn't just another day at work. It was a day to prove that change wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It was something real, something he had the power to make last. He looked around the showroom, the same shiny luxury cars, the gleaming glass walls, but nothing felt the same anymore. They were just cars, objects. And he was no longer defined by them. Blake's thoughts were interrupted as the sound of a sleek engine roared through the parking lot. The unmistakable growl of a Rolls-Royce Phantom filled the air, drawing the attention of every employee in the room. Blake's heart raced, the familiar thrill of a VIP arrival rushing through him. But this wasn't just any VIP. Marcus's Rolls-Royce rolled to a stop, its chrome trim catching the sunlight. The door opened, and out stepped Marcus Carter, his presence as commanding as ever. He was followed by Alexis, her confidence radiating with every step, her posture straight, her eyes filled with quiet strength. Blake stood frozen for a moment, watching them. He had seen them in passing before, but this time it was different. This time, they were here not as customers, but as something far more important. They were here to be heard. Marcus looked at Blake as he approached, his eyes steady, calm, but with a depth that spoke volumes. Alexis's gaze flickered to Blake, a faint smile tugging at her lips. There was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness, just an unspoken understanding that this moment had been coming. "Good morning, Blake," Marcus said, his voice firm yet not unkind. "I'm here today not just to buy a car. I'm here to remind you of what true respect and dignity look like." Blake's breath caught in his throat. The weight of Marcus's words settled on him, but it wasn't a burden. It was a truth he had come to embrace. "Listening," Blake said quietly, his voice steady. "And I'm sorry for everything." Marcus nodded slightly, as though he had been expecting those words. "Not here for an apology, Blake. I'm here to show you that actions speak louder than words. You've shown me that you're willing to learn. Now, you'll have a chance to prove that change is possible, not just for you, but for this entire place." Blake felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had been given a chance to do more than just apologize. He was being given the opportunity to live by the standards he had failed to uphold before. It was a chance to truly change. As Marcus and Alexis walked through the showroom, Blake followed, each step a reminder of how far he had come. The employees watched in silence as Marcus approached the sales desk, Alexis by his side. The atmosphere in the room was different, charged with an energy Blake had never experienced before. "Blake," Marcus said, turning to face him, "this is a new beginning, for you and for the dealership. No more pretending. No more judging people by what they wear or how they look. We treat everyone with the same level of respect, no exceptions." Blake felt his heart swell with pride. He hadn't realized how much he had needed this until now. The chance to stand for something bigger than himself, to let go of his old prejudices and assumptions. "I understand," Blake replied, his voice clear and firm. "And I promise this will be different." As Marcus and Alexis completed the paperwork for the Lamborghini, the entire showroom felt different. The usual chatter of customers and employees was quieter now, more thoughtful. Blake watched as Alexis smiled, a knowing look passing between her and her father. She had been right to believe in herself, and Blake was proud to witness it. When the deal was done, Marcus turned to Blake one last time. "You're not alone in this," Marcus said, his voice softening. "You're part of a team now, Blake. You've earned that." Blake nodded, feeling the weight of those words. He wasn't just a salesman anymore. He was part of something that mattered. Part of a movement that could change the way people saw the world, one person at a time. As they left, Alexis turned back to look at Blake. "Thank you," she said simply. Her smile was small but powerful, a quiet acknowledgement that the past was behind them. Blake watched as the Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled away from the dealership, its sleek frame disappearing down the street. He stood there for a moment, letting the sound of the engine fade into the distance. And for the first time in a long time, Blake Thompson felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.